So since its beginning, America has not had a chance to really catch its breath. Good morning. Since its beginning, America really hasn't had a chance to catch its breath. It started in the middle of a Revolutionary War. It has had to negotiate with Britain and France in the middle of their in the middle of their wars. It's had troubles between southern states and northern states and trying to figure out the Chesapeake Bay and the Massachusetts Bay, trying to figure out how to coexist. It's had trouble with natives on the western border in the Ohio River Valley. They really haven't had a chance to stop and take a breath. And you all remember how many elections it was before there were parties, right? And when we talked about the first president being elected, he was elected unanimously. George Washington was elected unanimously. How far into his presidency was it before there were parties fighting with each other? Do y'all remember?
Like right after?
Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't it like the next election?
Yeah, the very next election after George Washington was split almost 50-50 between these two parties. So America really hasn't had a chance to stop and catch its breath. In the big picture of the world, in 1815, Napoleon has finally been defeated. And that seems like a small thing. He took over most of Europe, and then he was defeated by a coalition of European powers. And then he was exiled to an island, the island of Elba, where he lived under guard. But there were people that were still sympathetic to him out there on that island. So they managed to set him free. And the thought was they were going to set him free. He was going to re-raise his army. He was going to take over Europe again. And this time he would defeat them completely. But actually what happened is that he fought like 2 battles and lost. And then Napoleon was once and for all just set down and set aside and not a problem anymore. So in 1815, all of the biggest powers in Europe got together and the Congress had a meeting called the Congress of Vienna. And in this meeting, they basically decided that the world needed stability. And the best way for the world to have stability is if all the rulers were, if everybody agreed on who the rulers of these kingdoms were and where the borders of these kingdoms were, and everybody decided to abide by that. And most of the people making decisions for that were old world monarchists, old noble families, old aristocratic families. And the rulers that they chose to put in charge of all of these countries were old kings and queens. So they wanted to put back the old way of Europe working. They wanted a king of France and a king of Britain and all of these forces to respect each other's sovereignty. And they drew the borders with like permanent marker. They drew the borders and they all agreed on them. Then one of the borders they agreed on was this one. This was the border that they agreed on. This is the United States of America. This belongs to the Americans. It's not something that you can colonize anymore. No more marching troops into America, and no more trying to get your colonies back, Britain, and no more helping them try to get France. No more of that. That's done. America is its own country now. Okay, so that's what's happened in 1815, and that's how the War of 1812 wrapped up. So what this creates is there's a lot of sort of shuffling for position in Europe, a lot of people kind of nudging each other out of the way and establishing their own territory and being like, for a little while, we're just going to concentrate on our country. France for France and Britain for Britain. We're just going to concentrate on what our country needs. So America, the best thing that they can possibly do at this point is not get involved too much with what's going on in Europe. The best thing they can do is stand back in their corner and go, we're done fighting with y'all for a while. Just leave us the hell alone. And so that's kind of what they do. America becomes very isolationist. So James Madison was the president that declared war on Britain because he believed that Britain was sending weapons to the Native Americans to attack American settlers. James Madison was the one that declared that war, and it was during James Madison's presidency that war was won. January of 1815 was the War of New Orleans. So James Monroe was his friend and colleague and was a part of his party, and they had cooperated on a bunch of things. So James Monroe was the logical person to follow him, and there wasn't a very big fight about that. So because they had just won the war, they had their borders established so that nobody needed to fight over them anymore. And the presidency passed peacefully from one Democratic Republican to another Democratic Republican. It was what we call the era of good feelings. Everybody is happy to be an American, and there's sort of this new nationalism that it doesn't matter what state you're from, be proud to be an American. And the presidency passed peacefully from one candidate to the next. Let's look at why. What happened to the other party? What happened to the Federalists? Okay, so it was the Democratic Republicans and it was the Federalists. And the Federalists had, won the second election, barely, but they had won it. They had won the election right after George Washington, because John Adams was a Federalist. But they had made some choices that were not really helpful to their cause. The Federalists in 1807, way back in 1807, they had been the ones that had protested the embargo. They had been the ones that screamed the loudest about not being able to import and export things to England. They were the ones that had protested against going to the war in Britain, which doesn't look good, because if Britain is giving weapons to the Native Americans and your whole party is like, but let's not fight with them over it, what does it look like you're doing? I mean, if you're not standing up to them and saying, stop that, what are you doing? Yes?
Seditious?
Say again?
Like seditious acts?
Yeah, a little bit. You're basically siding with the British and saying it's okay for them to be attacking, for them to be giving, Native Americans weapons so that they can attack the Americans. So that doesn't look, but it was more important to the Federalists to keep good trade with Britain than it was to go to war with Britain.
Yes.
Okay, and if Britain hadn't burned down the Washington, D.C., then one of the things that was going to happen is that the Hartford Convention, which was a group of northern states that didn't want to, well, not really even northern states, northern cities, that didn't want to go to war with Britain, formed what was called the Hartford Convention with the intention of trying to change the government's mind about things. And by the middle of the war, by the second year of the War of 1812, like by 1813, they had actually written out letters of secession. They were going to take themselves and make a new country. There was somebody that was involved with this that might surprise you. I don't know if you're paying attention close enough to recognize it, but there was a man who was disgruntled because he'd been basically kicked out of being the vice president for shooting somebody, who was a part of this movement of
Hamilton?
Say again?
Wasn't it Aaron Burr?
Aaron Burr, that's right. Aaron Burr was part of this, let's go ahead and form our own country. So Aaron Burr, who was basically denied the presidency when he ran against Jefferson, because Alexander Hamilton told everybody he was too power hungry and wanted his own country that he could be king of, actually went to New England and participated in drafting a secession letter. Like, we make a really big deal out of when the South does that in the 1860s when they secede, but it actually happened in the North first. So they drafted letters of secession, and they were writing down to Washington, D.C. to put them in the hands of President Madison when the British attacked and burned Washington, D.C. So they weren't able to make contact with the president to hand over their letters of secession. And they were like, we can wait until this is over. We'll do it then. And then America won that war. And they were like, or we could not do it. Also an option. We could just put this back in our files and keep it for later. And so the embarrassment of that has caused a lot of people to flee the Federalist Party and move over to the victorious party, to the party that's actually winning. So in the election of 1816, you can see by the green states how much of a majority the Democratic Republicans have when they elect Monroe. There's tiny little places where the Federalists still have just a little bit of power, and that's basically the places where the Hartford Convention was the strongest. But in 1816, they are basically being, 34 to 183. So like 84% of the vote went to the Democratic Republican candidate, James Monroe. In 1820, the majority was somewhat starker. In 1820, there was literally only one person that voted for, so it's the closest that we get to a unanimous president since George Washington. Only one elector didn't vote for James Monroe, and 3 electors didn't vote. So he only lost by 4 votes. So this is what we call a peaceful transition of power. And that's the end of the 2-party system, and that's why we only have one party in our country today. Right? No, Okay. All right. So let's talk about what happens next. So James Monroe made a really important diplomatic decision about the Federalists. And one of the reasons that this happened is because during his first term in office, he reached out to the Federalists and he said, I disagree with your position, but I want to use your gifts. Do you want to be part of my government anyway, even though you are not part of my party, which was something that the previous ones hadn't really done so much. Jefferson hadn't really done that. So James Monroe reached out to, he didn't publicly humiliate or persecute his opponents. He allowed the Federalists to still hold office, and he didn't reward people who had supported him with offices. He did it based on merit, which was good. So as a result, what happened is that Federalists started to drift out of their party and into serving the Democratic Republicans, because why not? They still got to do the same job, and they still got to be a part of the government. And so that's probably why most of the party just died. The Federalist Party just withered and died and ceased to exist. Now, inside the Democratic Party, the Democratic Republican Party, there began to be this like tug of war between people who were conservative pro-Jeffersonians, people who were like, we should still be doing things the way Jefferson did them, and people who believed that, so it was new nationalists and old Jeffersonians. New people who were like, well, on the other side of this victory, we should re-examine all of our principles and we should be a whole country again, instead of not so much with the states' rights. Maybe separating ourselves into states wasn't the best idea for how to distribute power. Maybe it's better if we actually think of ourselves as a whole country with a central federal government. Maybe that's better for us, which is what the Federalists thought. But it didn't matter because, they just won this war. So there's already breaking inside the party, but there's still only just one party. So that's cool. So in the wake of this, we have somebody who's a new nationalist named Henry Clay. Henry Clay comes up a lot during the early part of American history, but he's never presidential candidate. He's just a senator from Kentucky. And but he is a kingmaker. Y'all know what a kingmaker is? Have y'all heard that term? Yeah, what's a kingmaker?
Someone who doesn't become king themselves, but
It helps.
Right. It's somebody who chooses who the winner should be. It's somebody who figures out who the winner should be and then makes them the winner. And we have kingmakers now. We have kingmakers work behind the scenes in every major presidential election that we have.
Kind of like lobbyists, right?
But with the power to actually, like Mitch McConnell was a kingmaker.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Because he himself is never going to run for president, but if he gives his endorsement to somebody, then
I
there's
can
a
see
chance they're going to win. So he was a kingmaker. I don't know if he still is or not, because his candidate lost. So, but I think part of the reason that his candidate lost is because he lost his enthusiasm for supporting him. So there are kingmakers within both parties, and there are people who have a lot of power inside the political party. Okay, so Henry Clay is a kingmaker. He's a natural negotiator. He's really good at putting his view across in such a way that you really think it's probably supposed to be your view. He helped negotiate the treaty that got Britain out of America at the end of 1814. He was there helping negotiate the treaty in December of 1814. So his contribution to this moment is to help to develop a new economic system for this country while it's united. Let's unite and solve some problems. But he's going to come up several times because for several presidents, he basically puts the party back together, even though it really wants to split up. So let's talk about the American School of Economics. This is not an economics class, and I'm not an economics person, so we're going to do this part really fast. But the basic idea of Alexander Hamilton's plan in the beginning was that if America wants to become strong on its own right, then we need to protect American industries. We need to build infrastructure, and we need to decentralize finance. So let's make sure all of those terms are basically correct. What are the American industries at this time? Would anybody like to hazard a guess? During the late 1700s, early 1800s, what are their actual industries?
tobacco.
Right, tobacco.
Cotton.
Yeah, Indigo is a cash crop, so I guess that's the beginning of an industry. But what's the end product of that industry? What do you do with indigo?
Clothing.
Right, clothing, textiles, right? You take the indigo and you dye the cotton-made fabric with it, and now you have indigo fabric. So the industry is actually fabric, it's actually textile. What's another industry that's big in America at this time is shipping. The shipping industry, because America has access to lots and lots of lumber and has the space to build ships out of that lumber. So building ships and then selling them back and forth to Europe and then using them for shipping goods back and forth to Europe is a big industry. It's arguably the biggest industry, are textiles and shipping. What is infrastructure? What are we talking about when we say build infrastructure? If I said this town really needs to work on its infrastructure, what would we be talking about?
It's internal government.
Not really. Yeah, it's like the roads. Infrastructure is like the roads, the communication system, the water towers, anything that makes a town function properly is infrastructure. A lot of times people use the term to describe how we need to fix the infrastructure of an organization, but the reason they do that is because those people are responsible for these things. So if I was going to say this university really needs to work on its infrastructure, what I mean is there needs to be somebody in charge of tech support to keep the wiring working right. The infrastructure is actually the roads and stuff like that. So that's the second thing. Connect cities together by providing ways to get from one place to another and build up communication. And the third one is centralized finances. Right now, when we started, we had 13 different state economies, 13 different state money systems, 13 different states trying to all run banking together. Europe can't deal with that. We can't trade with Europe with 13 different money systems. So what we need to do is have just one and have everybody else be underneath that. That was Hamilton's idea. Henry Clay's American system uses Hamilton's ideas, but then it imposes things that will specifically build up. His American system uses Hamilton's American School of Economics and wants to use it to build up America's riches. So one of the ways they do that is with tariffs. Do y'all understand how tariffs work? Okay, tariffs are the money that you pay to import something or the money that you pay to export something. Usually it's the money that you pay to import something. Okay, so Britain makes textiles, France makes textiles, India makes textiles, but why would you buy American textiles instead of any of those? Yes?
They'll be cheaper.
Because it'd be cheaper. So how do we make it cheaper?
Lower the tariff. Oh, wait.
Right. By making you pay extra to bring it in from another country. Okay,
yeah.
So the way that America is set up at this point in the textile industry, the South grows cotton, picks cotton, mills cotton, sends the cotton up to the North. The North takes the cotton and makes fabric, makes textiles out of it, and then sells it back to the South because the South doesn't make their own textiles. So if you are a Southern planter, you are choosing between paying extra to import your textiles from Europe or pouring money into the northern states because they're the ones with the textiles that aren't being tariffed. So at first, this idea is not happy making to everybody. The South especially doesn't like it, but they get that it's better than pouring money into Europe. So they go ahead and go along with it, even though they're not happy. Okay, and then federal money to raise money to create new infrastructure like the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal connects several of the waterways up like around the New York area. And it's extremely valuable for that shipping industry, which benefits the North. The Cumberland Road is actually a road that's paved right into the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. So it connects the North and South through a road, which really benefits the North because it makes it easier for them to get their raw materials. Okay, so Henry Clay's system really does a lot to benefit the northern states. And it's okay for the southern states, but it's mostly to benefit the North. He also wants to recharter the US Bank. The US Bank was founded during Washington's time, and his charter has run out. It ran out in 1811, and Jefferson didn't believe in it, so he didn't recharter it. Madison didn't believe in it, so he didn't recharter it. So there's no central US Bank. The reason why this is a bad thing is because all these little state banks are negotiating their own deals, are negotiating their own financial systems. And if you don't have a national bank, then you can't pull taxes in and use them for federal infrastructure. Everything has to go through state banks. So that's his system. Even though there are objections to this, it still gets passed because the party that's in power really wants to cash in on this whole era of good feelings thing. Like, nobody wants to put up a fight against a system that will benefit part of America because it's all America now. Just for a minute, what benefits the North is good for the South because we're all part of the same country. Just for a minute during this time. Monroe goes on all these tours during his presidency. He dresses as a Revolutionary War hero. I don't think he actually was one, but he dresses as one. He dresses in a uniform, and he goes out and makes speeches, and he shakes hands. And these goodwill tours, especially in New England, where the Federalists were, they really love him up there. He has like rock star sized crowds when he goes on these goodwill tours. So that's how they got the name. As he's going up through New England, somebody says, "We're in the midst of an era of good feelings." So that's how he gets his name. Okay. So we're trying to stabilize American economy. We're trying to make America really productive and really fruitful so that the next time there's trade back and forth with Europe, it will be beneficial to America, and America won't be like the little kid trying to tag along. It'll be strong for America. But Europe is having its own problems. In 1815, right after the Napoleonic War, a volcano erupted in Indonesia, a massive volcano. So like they just finished in January, in December of 1814, they negotiated all of these borders. They put them into gear in 1815. And late May, I think, 1815, a tornado erupted, Mount Tambora. And the result of that was a cloud of ash that spread over all of Europe, which then made it so that there was literally no summer. What kind of effect would that have on the economy of Europe? Can you imagine?
It would kill it.
Not
How?
very good because, like, the crops can't really grow without the sun.
All right, and what happens if you don't have any crops?
No food.
Right, there's no food. You have to import all of your food. So this affected so much of Europe. And I don't want you to think it just wiped out all agriculture. It just took a huge dent out of it. As a result of that, a lot of crops that Europe was growing, and this was all of Europe and some of India and some of Asia. So all of these places that grow things like cotton and like tobacco and like other things like that, all of them, grapes, anything you can make booze out of, it all kind of comes grinding to a halt in Europe for 1 year. And during that 1 year is the year that Henry Clay's American system went into effect, with its high tariffs out and its high tariffs in. So as a result of that, suddenly America is in a position to be one of the richest places in the world because they're the only people that still have crops growing. They're the people, they're not affected by this cloud of ash. So all of those cash crop states have a huge open market to sell everything that they have to, and a huge demand for more, always more. Demand. Because it sets back the European agriculture world so far, just to be out for a year, it sets them back so far that there's a huge boom in American economy. So America begins to plant more and more and more. What's the problem with planting because somebody else is having a bad year? Expanding everything because somebody had one bad year? What do you think is going to happen? Anybody?
We're going to crash and burn
Oh, what makes you say that?
because we're going to overstock.
Okay, so during this 1 year when the agriculture was booming, 10 new states opened up. 10 new states. And in order for a state to open up, people have to move into it. There has to be a minimum population. So there has to be enough people moving into that area to form a population that the federal government can recognize as a state. So what happens during this time is that massive members of the population go and open up farms in other states to start selling crops because apparently that's really lucrative. And they sell it to Europe. and they take out loans to do it. And those loans go through state banks that aren't regulated through a national bank. So I would say for a year and a half, the entire population of America is moving into these new states and building new farms and setting themselves up so that they could grow massive amounts of crops because they think that the market over in Europe is never going to end. The problem is that this was based on one eruption, one volcanic eruption that scattered one ash cloud over all of Europe and killed agriculture. You know what else volcanic ash does? Does anybody know? Have y'all ever
Doesn't
eaten
it help?
something that was
It
grown
makes
in
fertile
volcanic
down,
ash?
fertile ground, isn't it?
If you ever
Yeah.
have the opportunity to eat something that was grown in volcanic ground, eat it, because it is the best stuff imaginable. Like, what happens when volcanic ash falls to the ground is it rejuvenates the soil like magic. Okay, volcanic ash, when it sinks into the ground and becomes watered and becomes soil again, is some of the richest soil you can possibly imagine. So for 1 year, Europe was covered with a volcanic ash cloud and their agriculture tanked. In the years
Miss Mindy.
that followed, their agriculture boomed. But by that time, Americans had already moved into and started farms with the expectation that they'd be able to sell all those crops to Europe.
Doesn't it
not
also
Say again?
doesn't it also like not help because because of the fact they were replanting so much that it would also help lead up to the Dust Bowl and stuff?
Yeah, but you're getting a little ahead of yourself. You're talking pretty specifically about cotton there.
Mhm.
And you're talking about kind of this area being the soil depletion in this area here. So you're getting a little ahead of us. But yeah, overplanting is a big problem. You overplant your fields and your fields get exhausted. You can't keep producing. And the price of what you're producing just gets lower and lower and lower. So you think you have to plant more in order to make the same amount of money. And eventually you start, getting seriously into debt. This leads to what's called the Panic of 1819. All of these farmers who took out loans from state banks suddenly found themselves in debt and unable to do anything about it. There was this huge market, and during that huge market, the banks were like, anybody who wants to go start a farm, we'll send you a loan. And the banks, because they're not regulated by a central bank, they don't have to have gold in their vaults to match the amount of money they say they're willing to spend. So they'll sell you a deed with money they don't have and expect you to pay it back when you're successful. It's called speculation. So there's this huge speculation bubble of anybody who wants to open a farm, go and open a farm, our banks will support you. And then they're like, okay, now we're going to need you to pay back those loans. And you as a farmer are like, the market I thought was going to be there is not there because apparently volcanoes calm down. So that's apparently not something that's going to last forever. So as a result, farms get foreclosed like crazy and debtors go to prison like crazy. And as a result, the federal government has to kind of save them. One of the big cases that happens during this time is a case called McCullough versus Maryland. And I probably won't expect you to remember that. I don't know if it'll be on a test by its name or not. But I just want to give you an idea of an example of something that can go wrong here. Okay, when Monroe, in his second term, he rechartered the US Bank so that there would be centralized banking again. But all these states also have banks. So you have the State Bank of Maryland, you have the State Bank of Virginia, you have State Bank of Kentucky, you have all of these state banks. Maryland decided, because it wanted people to trade through their bank instead of through the US Bank, they imposed a tax on all out-of-state banks. The problem is there's only one out-of-state bank, and that's the federal bank. That's the US Bank. So the US Bank refused to pay it. They refused to pay the tax. And the Maryland sued them all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled for the US Bank that the US Bank can come into a state, establish branches, and not have to pay the state taxes. Even if the Maryland has a state tax on banks that aren't part of the Maryland Bank. To a casual person who's just holding their money somewhere, that might not make a difference, but you pay fees when you bank all the time. You have, most of y'all probably, if you have a bank account, it's with a national bank, right? It's not with a local state bank. But in some local state banks, if you try to trade in and out of a federal bank, they charge you a tax for it. It's the U.S. National Bank doesn't have to pay that tax as a result of this case. So what that does is immediately states' rights people are like, hey, the U.S. government is taking too much power again, and we have a split in the party. The states' rights people and the Federalist people split the party again. There's one other kind of big thing that happens. One other big split in this era of good feelings that happens, and that has to do with slavery. The thought was that slavery would start to die out because when you look at it from a practical perspective, maintaining a workforce with slavery is not actually very practical. You have to house them, you have to feed them. Workers who are enslaved don't work the way laborers who are paid work. The worst you can do is punish them for not working very hard. And weirdly, and I know this sounds crazy, that doesn't make them work any harder. So the whole issue of the whole point of slavery is losing its power in the early 1800s because it's just not a very practical way of maintaining a workforce. It's hard to make slaves do what they're told, and you have to punish them if they don't. And then they still don't do it, and they get sick, and they had what was called the slave malaise, which was this weird. And if you read journals of the time, you actually read about foremen writing about it in documents to their bosses saying the slaves have caught this disease which makes them stupid, which makes it so you tell them to do something and they don't seem to understand you, and so they don't do it right. And what this was actually was massive passive resistance. Like the slaves were actually resisting doing what they were told, but they were like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. And they were like, this is a disease that's moving among the slaves and we need to find a cure for it. I'm not sure what's causing it, but for some reason their intelligence is seeping away and we can't figure out why. They were just resisting it, okay? So it's not a very practical system. So they're pretty sure that it's gonna ease out. And then in 1816, the cotton gin is invented. Now the cotton gin actually makes it easier to separate the strands of the cotton from each other, which makes it easier to process the cotton. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into like industrial innovation and stuff like that. I don't want to get into it, but I will say that since it's easier to process the cotton, people plant more cotton and grow more cotton. And so somebody has to pick more cotton, which is the one thing that the machines don't do. So slavery actually booms because it's easier to process the cotton. They were supposed to run out. They were supposed to, in 1787, when they negotiated the Constitution, one of the things they said is 20 years from then, they would get rid of importing slaves. No more new slaves coming into the US. Okay, that was supposed to end 20 years after that negotiation. So it was supposed to end in 1817. In 1816, one of the ways that expresses itself is there should be no new slave states. Okay, slavery we should put a cap on it. We should make sure that it's only these southern states, and as they move over to other systems, as we spread further west, no new slave states. Of course, the southern states can't live like that because their whole economy is based on slavery. And the products that they grow, as Savannah was saying, wear out the soil. So they need to continue to expand into new ground, and they need to be able to bring their slaves with them when they do. So this is the Missouri Compromise of 1819. They allow Missouri to be a slave state because it already is, because most of the population that moves into Missouri is already slaveholding people. But other than that, as they spread west, no new states above this line will be slave states. Okay, so this is 3630. This is the latitude 3630, and the idea is as these places in the Louisiana Purchase get populated, none of them will be slave states. That's the Missouri Compromise, except for Missouri itself, which is still a slave state. How do you think that's going to work? Everybody happy? That's going to be fair. Remember where the Louisiana Purchase actually is? Do you remember what it looks like?
Yeah, it doesn't really work that way.
Well, let's take another look at it just so we go back and find it again, because I think it's in one of my earlier maps. Ooh, hold on. I'll find it on the one up there in a minute. I don't have eyes that work that way. Okay. Okay. Take a look at this and remember that this is roughly where the line is. Okay, this is where the 3630 line is. So this is all the territory that the US is expanding into. Where's the problem? What do you see? This is the territory that the US owns. All of this is owned by Spain, right? We're
It's
not
all
planning.
above that line.
It's mostly above that line. That's right. So almost all of it is above that line. So that's a problem. That's a problem for this group of people that actually makes all of their living off of slaves, off of the aristocracy of slaves, off of the being able to move into new land so that their crops don't get exhausted. This is a problem for them. So it's a compromise and it works for a minute, but there's immediately going to be fights about it. Okay, there's one other thing that Monroe does during his presidency, and we don't get a whole lot into it because it has to do with more, has to do with foreign stuff that doesn't really come into play until after the Civil War. But under the Monroe Doctrine was basically because during this post-Napoleonic age, all of these South American countries started declaring their own independence. They all started. Now, at first, some of them wanted to ally with each other. Some of them wanted to be like, let's put our country, all of our countries together under one country, and then we'll appoint somebody emperor of that country, and all of South America can be its own country. But most of the time, it was individual countries. Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Grenada, all of these little South American countries, one after another, declared independence and then fought against the powers that held them, the Spanish mostly, but fought to kick them out, okay? And James Monroe, the fear in James Monroe was that as they started to declare their independence, the European parties would come back in and try to take them back over. And when they did, they would start looking hungrily at America again. The biggest part that they're worried about is up here where the Russians have started to try to make inroads, and Spain and Portugal are starting to move up the Central Coast. So Monroe puts out an edict that says any European country that comes in and tries to reestablish colonies in South America, the United States of America will view that as a hostile act and will take action against them. And because we've just had one good year of booming economy, and because we've just had a couple of years of developing a military, because we just won the War of 1812, and because we invested in our military in the meantime, in 1820, it looks like we might be able to challenge the Dutch if they showed up and tried to set up a colony, or the British if they tried to set up a colony. So Monroe puts out this policy that says, if you come to South America with the intent of setting up colonies again, or taking power of the colonies that are there, Russia will see that as an act of war, or America will see that as an act of war, and we will fight you, even though it's in South America, even though it's not attached to them, because they're trying to keep these imperial parties off of their border. That Monroe Doctrine will become important later, but I just want to make sure most of the countries in Europe were like, whatever, if you say so. You know, we're not really scared of you, just so you know. Pretty sure we could take you if we needed to. But some countries took it as an insult, like Prussia took it as an insult and immediately started trying to set up a holding in Argentina. But anyway, so that's Monroe's presidency. That's the era of good feelings. What we have at the end of this is that we have the Federalists are gone, but the Democratic Republicans are splitting into two parties, states' rights and federal rights. The American economy had one great big injection of wealth, and then it collapsed a little bit because of the speculation. But at the end of this era, America is actually a trading force to be reckoned with. Right up there with Britain and France and Spain. They are actually holding, they're not a baby country anymore. They're actually holding their own. So that's the end of the Monroe Doctrine. Anybody have any questions about any of this?